Let's speak to Ammar Kahf in Doha. He's the Executive Director at Omran Center for Strategic Studies. Ammar, good to speak to you as always. So, first of all, what do you make of this deal, and do you think it will finally be able to hold?
Well, I don't see, unfortunately, the teeth within the agreement. Who forces any of the sides to comply? And historically, the regime has manipulated those temporary fixes to gain more land and change the balance of power on the ground. And so unless such an agreement is tied with a clear political path, I am not very hopeful that this would work. I sure wish that it would work, but it doesn't contain the necessary preconditions. In the initial talks between the Russians and the US last week, through the ambassador to the Syrian opposition, there were some very few teeth into the agreement where the regime is forced by the Russians to comply. And if they don't comply, they would go back to the UN Security Council. And so there must be a method by which the regime could be forced to comply. More than that, there is no such bloc that is called a regime. There are several blocs. There are 1,000 fighters from Nujaba, from Iran, that came into Aleppo just last week. Who controls these? Who forces them to comply? And unfortunately, what's happening is that there is no central bloc that controls all types of the military called a regime in Damascus. There are several blocs. They are very loosely tied together. And so unless the Russians guarantee the full compliance of a full ceasefire that leads to a political path, as we see, this is a very limited scope agreement that targets only the fighting of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. I mean, certainly the Syrian people want to fight those two, but the facilitator of those two groups have been the Assad regime, who has killed far more people and has caused a far more security danger to the neighboring countries than ISIS or al-Nusra.
Okay, well, first of all, let's just deal with the Syrian bloc that's beneath Bashar al-Assad, as it were. Surely pressure from Russia, pressure that says you must stop aerial bombardments, pressure that says we will withdraw support if you don't adhere to this rule, surely that'll be enough to stop them fighting?
Well, I mean, the regime has been relying on diversifying its sources of support. Now the Iranians have plenty of cash on their books to support several groups, militias that have crossed countries from Iraq, from Iran, from Afghanistan, from several countries around the world that really don't report to any hierarchical decision-making process. Unless an operation room targets all foreign fighters on Syria and halts and controls the very few remaining segments within the Syrian military, tied with a political track. This agreement so far has no clear connection to the Geneva communique. This agreement has, it doesn't clarify how will it lead to a political settlement. Just having a ceasefire has always been used by the regime to gain more land under the guise of fighting terrorism and exterminating those bad groups within Syria. And unfortunately, nobody talks about the foreign fighters that are fighting with the regime.
And Ammar, do you see this at all as being a first step and a first positive step? Obviously, we had the HNC a couple of days ago coming out with a very robust framework for how a post-Assad Syria may work. That's, as far as I understand it, not part of this communique today. But do you not see this as the first tentative steps towards something looking like peace?
I mean, it certainly needs several steps to get to a sustainable peace agreement. I'm not saying this is a completely useful step, but nevertheless, it does not fulfill the necessary requirements for a transition of power, a political solution, which the Syrian opposition has proven so far, not only in the recent vision for transitional period that the HNC has announced a few days ago, but the Syrian coalition has announced similar visions before in 2013. And have been to London and have presented a complete comprehensive plan. The opposition does not lack a plan or any plans for a complete transition. In fact, there has been several attempts and several very grassroots, comprehensive, consensus-building conferences within the Syrian opposition that have more or less agreed on the general principles of a democratic, free society in Syria and what are the different stages, whether it be 3 or 4 or 5 stages. We at Omran have also published something of that similar. We don't lack of those visions. We lack a political will on the international community to tie any agreements of limited scope such as this with a clear political path.
Okay. Well, Ammar Kahf from the Omran Centre, always good to speak to you. Thanks for joining us, TRT World.